So Shannon is a marine ecologist who studies ecosystem interactions and functions, and you'll hear all about her work soon. Her PhD focused on inshore coral reefs of northwest Western Australia, which are exposed to really harsh environmental conditions. And she's now researching intertidal habitats of the same coastline as a postdoctoral research fellow at Edith Cowan University, with the aim of understanding rates of primary production and nutrient flows within these ecosystems. I'm also going to say she is a keen diver and she's also a talented artist. So she's not just looking at fish, she's also painting them and drawing them. So yeah, talented all-rounder. Very happy to have Shannon with us and very happy to have you at NAGLE with us. So I'm going to turn my camera off now and hand you over to Shannon. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Sil. And thank you to everyone in the class today. Hopefully I can provide some fun insights to coral reefs for you guys and not be too boring and sciencey, but we'll see how we go. So before I start on talking about characteristics of coral communities, I'll give a little bit of a background furthermore of myself and kind of how I got to be in the current research position that I'm in. Like any young girl who grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s, I had a unhealthy obsession with The Little Mermaid and H2O, just add water. So all I wanted to do was be underwater and grow a tail. When I went into university, I was originally studying zoology and environmental science. And then I spontaneously booked myself onto a trip to Fiji to work on a volunteer program on bull sharks. And this is where I got my dive ticket. And after spending a month with these amazing, beautiful, big animals, I decided then and there I'd swap from environmental science to marine science, and got completely obsessed with diving from then on as well. After my undergrad, I did an honours year where I looked at reproduction of corals off of Perth. So you can see there a little snippet from one of my slides of a coral polyp and their little gametes, those little dark beady things. So I basically spent a year measuring and counting these, which was more fun than it sounds. But during that time, I also took a month off and lived up in Ningaloo in a tent and was basically just doing a free internship on one of the whale shark boats, which of course was incredible and so much fun, even if I wasn't getting paid. And then after honours, I got the dream job over on the Great Barrier Reef as a marine biologist. I actually don't really have many photos of this time in my life, so I've got some snippets from Google. You can just pretend that's me snorkeling. That was the boat I worked on, and some photos of my dog with a tropical flower crown, because she's all the photos I have from that time. Little did I know this job would mostly be cleaning up people's vomit, so it wasn't as glamorous as I first suspected. After this, I went down to the Gold Coast and did my dive master, and then I got invited to come back to Western Australia to do my PhD at Curtin. So that saw me doing lots of diving and reef work in Exmouth Gulf in the beautiful clear waters, as you can see there in the top left. I'll touch on that a little bit later on in this presentation. And then I went and worked a few years in marine consulting, and I was lucky in this time. The company I worked for paid for me to do my ADAS level 1, so my commercial dive ticket. So I got to do lots of really cool commercial diving, as well as coastal monitoring. And yes, now I am back in academia as a researcher at ECU. And I still do a lot of reef work, but I'm also working on intertidal habitats, as mentioned before, like these incredible microbial mats in these hypersaline environments. So I'm trying to find a connection between them and the neighbouring coral reefs as well. So yeah, something a little bit different, but still awesome and fun. Cool. So we'll get on to corals and coral reefs. So as you guys probably know, corals are animals. They're not plants or rocks. And they can come in hard or soft varieties. I'm going to mostly focus on hard corals in this presentation. So for the basis of every coral are coral polyps. So from the coral gametes, they meet in the water column and make larvae, and this larvae will settle down and stick onto a hard surface or substrate, and from there the polyps can develop and thrive. So these little polyps kind of look like upside down jellyfish. They're in the same family as anemones and jellyfish. So yeah, they can exist as individual coral polyps or giant colonies made up of hundreds of thousands of polyps. And each one of these polyps in a colony, so on the same coral structure, is a exact clone of each other. And they use their tentacles, shown there, to feed on tiny little particles in the water column. I'll go into a little bit more depth on their anatomy. I'm sorry that some of my photos are cropped at the edges for some reason. So as I said, they use their tentacles to grab little tiny things in the water column, and on each of these tentacles they have like tiny little extra tentacles that transport all the little stuff down into their mouth in the center of the polyp, and it goes down into their gut. But these polyps don't have complete digestive systems, so although they can eat the food, they can't absorb the nutrients, or they kind of lack the essential sugars to break down food and turn it into proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. So the corals have a symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae, which is a algae. So this algae, through photosynthesis, provides the coral polyp with those sugars and proteins. And then they can use that energy to build their calcium carbonate skeleton and form the morphology of the coral and help the coral grow. And through this photosynthesis, the zooxanthellae also gives the coral its colour. So as you can see in that picture on the right, polyps are actually clear. So yeah, when you see those bright coloured corals, it's because of this algae within them. Yeah, so as I said, the skeleton can grow in all different types of morphologies. There's a few different types of polyps as well, and they have different varieties of tentacles and kind of determine the morphology that the coral will grow in. So there's a bit of difference depending on where you are in the world, what you kind of call morphologies. But I'm just kind of going to go over the basic ones. So I'm sure everyone knows about branching coral. It's really beautiful, structurally complex, but it's a little bit weaker because its skeleton's finer. And within branching coral, there's like 5 other morphologies that, yeah. And then there's also foliose coral, sometimes called like cabbage coral, free-living corals like the mushroom corals that are just like one giant polyp, massive corals or boulder corals, tabular corals or plate corals, and then encrusting corals that grow like on the surface of the substrate. And then from these morphologies, there's typical species that grow in these morphologies, and each species kind of also belongs to or adopts a life history strategy. So these strategies, competitive, weedy, stress tolerant, or generalist, are determined by that species' growth form, the reproductive mode, the rates at which they grow, and their skeletal density. So these life history strategies can kind of help people predict what habitats or environments different coral species are going to live in, and how they're going to react to disturbances. For example, competitive corals are more like the branching corals, which are fast growing. So they tend to recover really quickly from stress events because they grow really quickly. And then your stress-tolerant corals, like the big bouldering ones with small polyps, they tend to do really well in harsher environments. And then generalists are kind of like all-rounder corals. All right, so we'll get more into community structures and forms. So I'm sure when I say like corals, you think of a big, beautiful, colourful tropical reef in clear, warm waters. So this is the general kind of Hollywood coral reef. They're large calcium carbonate structures with very high cover of coral and high diversity of different species. These kind of reefs are really important globally and worth a lot to lots of economies. These big reef structures form protection for a lot of coastlines because they break down wave energy. So they're really important, especially for low-lying countries like the tropical island nations. And through this as well, they also provide flood protection. So the shorelines aren't getting inundated and totally flooded. They have massive value for tourism, especially in developing countries like Indonesia. And these countries as well, they provide people with a lot of food. And 25% of all marine life live on coral reefs, even though they only cover 1% of the globe's surface. So yeah, they're really important for food and all of these other things. But they also provide more recently benefits to health and medical research. There's all sorts of tiny little particles that live on coral reefs that scientists are now finding to use in drugs and stuff to cure cancer and everything. So coral reefs can do it all. So they come in three main types. So fringing reefs, which come off of the coast. Barrier reefs, which are similar to fringing reefs, but they've developed over time. There's been a bit of a divide from the coastline and the reef, and there's the deeper lagoon section between the land and the reef. And then atolls. So atolls are formed from historic volcanoes. They're like fringing reefs around the volcano. And over time, these volcanoes have basically sunk, leaving a little ring atoll like that. So as well as these beautiful, gorgeous coral reefs, there are other types of coral communities. So, for example, turbid reefs. So these reefs are exposed to sedimentation. They're quite like muddy and dull, and some people think they're quite ugly. This is what I've done the majority of my work on. As you can imagine, working in these environments where sometimes you can't see past your elbow can be quite frustrating, but they're also, I find them quite amazing. So turbidity can be natural or human-induced. So some of these reefs exist off of natural rivers. So after rainfall events, there's all flooding of sedimentation, or up in Exmouth, where the fine sediment gets deposited on the water surface or the intertidal areas, and it gets flushed out during tides. That makes all of that water quite turbid. But then there's also human-induced turbidity through dredging around marinas, coastal developments and agriculture and such. So these reefs are usually covered in more those slow-growing, stress-tolerant corals. But there's some people now are saying that these reefs are probably going to be more resilient in the future because they offer shading to corals. So I'll discuss that a little bit later as part of a bleaching study that I was a part of. But it's also suggested that these reefs are going to become more common with climate change, with sea level rise. So further understanding them is really important, although they remain still quite understudied because they're so hard and annoying to work in. We've also got temperate reefs, so the reefs that we get down here at Perth or further south along the Great Southern Reef. So these are colder water reefs. They're rocky reefs, so they don't have the full calcium carbonate structure. It's more like rock, and have mostly encrusting corals that grow on them. Or here in this picture is this beautiful massive foliose coral field that's off of Esperance, which is really cool. People don't usually expect there to be amazing abundances of corals down here. So when we do find these epic sites, it's really cool. These corals also compete with algae and sponges for space. They're usually growing around big kelp forests as well. So yeah. And we also have Arctic or Antarctic and mesophotic corals. So mesophotic means like deep water with low light, so deeper than 30 meters. So in these environments, there's higher nutrients usually, and they're dominated by soft corals. A really, really cool example of a Arctic and mesophotic reef is, I don't know how to pronounce it, I'm just going to say Rost Reef in Norway, which is up to 350 meters deep and expands more than 40 kilometers, which is really cool. So I'm sure a lot of you guys are aware there's lots of threats to corals and coral reefs now and predicted to increase into the future, mostly because of climate change. So this is seeing increases in water temperatures. So most corals can thrive in about like 26 to 29, 30 degrees. So anything higher than that can really stress and damage corals. As well as this, there's acidification, flooding, and sea level rise. But then they also have external stresses from predation from pests such as crown of thorns starfish, which is shown up there. There's also a few diseases, stress from pollution, and disturbances such as cyclones. So I'll just delve a little bit into coral bleaching. So basically when the environment becomes stressful, like if it's too hot or there's extra pollutants, the corals become stressed, and a zooxanthellae by algae reacts as well and becomes toxic to the coral. So the coral has a health cleanse, it just sheds everything and expels the zooxanthellae, which leaves the coral white because it hasn't got that photosynthesizing color anymore. So the corals are still alive at this phase, but they are basically starving because they can't take up those nutrients. And if the environmental conditions go back to a nice healthy state quickly, the coral can readopt the algae and recover. But if these stress periods go on for too long, the coral will die. And bleaching is kind of like significant illnesses. Basically, once it's been bleached once, it can become more susceptible of being bleached in the future. And it also makes the skeleton a little bit more fragile, so that can be prone to further damage if there's a storm at the same time as a bleaching event. So it's suspected that those branching corals I was talking about before, those competitive ones, they can be a bit more susceptible to bleaching, whereas those bouldering hard corals, the stress tolerant ones, are usually more stress tolerant, so they don't bleach as easily. Recently, I was up in Exmouth Gulf with one of my colleagues, and we were there at the same time as a bleaching event. So we conducted a study to see if the clear water corals at Bundigi, which is more of a typical coral reef site, how they reacted compared to the reefs on the eastern side of the Gulf, which are more turbid or muddy. So as you can see in the pictures on the right, there was bleaching at all of these sites. But Bundigi, that clearwater site, all of the branching corals bleached. And then at the turbid sites on the other side of the Gulf, all of these stress-tolerant corals bleached, but all of these weaker branching corals were doing totally fine. So this was quite bizarre and hasn't been recorded much before. So here we saw a combination of stresses causing the bleaching. So at Bundigi, it was the heat of because it was during a heat wave, and as well as the intense light that was coming through the water column, causing those branching corals to bleach. And then on the turbid side, where it's quite muddy, the reefs were getting shaded, but on certain corals like these flatter, encrusting or bouldering corals, they also had the additional stress of sediment blocking their polyps. So usually if they're just dealing with the sedimentation, they're fine. They've got the energy to spit off the sediment. But under that increased temperature, they were already stressed and didn't have the energy to spit off the sediment. So yeah, these flat ones became really bleached, whereas all the branching ones, the sediment just falls off. So they were totally fine. From this study as well, we found that a lot of these massive bouldering corals recovered quite well, but unfortunately at Bundigi, a lot of these branching corals didn't do so well. So that was kind of what we were expecting as well. Also recently, I'm sure some of you may have been up to Coral Bay in the school holidays and seen the impacts of a massive bleaching event in Bills Bay. So this actually wasn't caused by high temperatures. This was caused by a coral spawning slick and really calm weather. So basically when the corals spawn, all of their larvae go up to the surface and it causes this gooey slick that smells really bad. Yeah, wouldn't recommend swimming in it. But usually this gets flushed out of the system or turned around. But in Bills Bay, there was no wind and really calm seas, so no wave energy at the time. So the water within Bills Bay just remained really stagnant and this slick just sat there. And so it didn't allow for oxygen transfer from the water column to the atmosphere. And basically there was a depletion of oxygen in the water, which caused a lot of bleaching and unfortunately a lot of coral death. So there's lots of research going on at the moment about this, but this has happened previously in smaller sections. I'm sure some of you may have known of, there's a few years ago there was like a die-off of fish in the area from one of these anoxic events. So this is an example of a natural induced bleaching event. So the future for coral reefs, there's a lot of questions and uncertainty with how certain areas are adapting or what we can do to kind of slow down climate change. So there's lots of programs growing little coral babies and putting them back out in the reef to increase coral cover. There's also heaps of amazing studies at the moment where people are breeding super corals in labs. They're genetically modifying them with really resilient corals and replanting them to see if we can populate damaged reefs with these more resilient corals. So there's lots of cool stuff happening and I'm quite hopeful that we will find some really cool solutions. But yeah, there's also other stuff that you guys can do yourselves. So this kind of diagram gets cut up a bit, but basically just trying to be a bit more environmentally friendly, and when you're snorkeling, not to touch the corals because that can also kind of stress them a bit. Yeah, just being a bit more sustainable with your seafood choices or eating meat less. And yeah, just being a bit more environmentally aware and choosing nice sun creams that don't stress the corals either. And yeah, that was just kind of like my little speedy crash course. I think I went through that a bit quick, but then we have more time for questions if anyone has any.
That was really great, Shannon. Thank you very much. Does anyone have a question? Yeah. Yeah? Yes. So I have a question if you're ready for questions. Can you hear us? Yep.
Yep. how long can like a coral stay alive for, like when it's being bleached before it like starves?
That was my question.
So it depends. It could be anywhere between a couple of weeks and up to 2 months. It depends on the type of coral and how intense the stresses are. Yeah. Thank you.
Question? Anyone want a question? I've got a question. You mentioned that your specialty is turbid reefs and they're really slow growing, but you said that might be a solution for sea level rise. Do you think they would be able to maintain, or do you think they'd have to adapt to a deeper environment?
Yeah, great question. So this is one of the unknown questions that we have for the future. So there's hypotheses that the increased sea level will create more accommodation space for corals to keep growing, because a lot of them just kind of exist at the water level. But then, yeah, the other suggestion is that if it's deeper, there'll be less light. But sea level rise isn't going to happen at a super rapid rate where, you know, suddenly corals are going to be 30 metres under. So I think the corals will grow at a similar rate to sea level rise, so they should be all right. Yeah, I think, does that answer your question? So yeah, I'm kind of hopeful that they will keep up and use that extra accommodation space to be able to thrive.
All right, thank you. Question? Yeah? Question? We've got another question. Just be loud.
What effect do you think may occur with the Woodside Browse gas project?
Wait, sorry, say that again.
What effects do you think may occur with the Woodside Browse gas project?
This is a hard question. There are a lot of issues, obviously, with mining and oil and gas industries contributing to fossil fuels, which are driving climate change. So there's obviously issues with that, and as well as issues with the infrastructure for a lot of these projects. But I will be devil's advocate and say that these companies need to employ consulting agencies to do heaps of monitoring for them, and they need to reach certain environmental targets to be able to get their licenses. So the Environmental Protection Authority do try and do as much as they can to kind of limit the immediate impacts of these projects. But in the long term, they are contributing to climate change, which is obviously an issue. But yes, I'm not going to say for or against.
Yeah, that's fine. We just know that infrastructure impacts the area around it, and I think as West Australians, people know a lot of people who have worked in those environments and have first-hand knowledge of, you know, practices versus what might actually be, what you're trying to achieve and what's actually achieved on a daily basis may not actually match.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, these companies as well do try and help facilitate a lot of research to try and offset their potential impacts as well. So yeah, there's good and bad.
Yeah. You got any other questions?
Do you think people will act fast enough against climate change to save the Great Barrier Reef, or do you think it's going to die?
The Great Barrier Reef has been experiencing really significant bleaching events and more rapidly. Unfortunately, this reef is under increased stress from pollution from agriculture and heaps of river runoff as well. But luckily for the reef, there is heaps of research being conducted and heaps of monitoring and rehabilitation programs. But we're also finding that some sections of the reef, like in the far north where it's really, really hot, are actually thriving. And like some areas down the bottom are kind of doing worse off, even though the water's cooler. So it's some new findings are looking really good, and coral cover is increasing between bleaching events because of these fast-growing species, which isn't great for diversity, but it's still providing a lot of that habitat and structure which we need from the reef. So yeah, the hopes are high that it can recover in some state, but it's never going to be like what it used to be back in the day, unfortunately.
Do you think those sort of pressures are true on the west coast as well? We don't have significant runoff from rivers in the way that Queensland does, but we do have, I mean, if you look at Shark Bay, significant warming events.
Yeah, so like you said, we're lucky we don't have all that runoff and heaps of extra nutrients going in, and also we don't have the population up in near Shark Bay or Ningaloo, so they're not having that immediate human-induced impacts. As well as all of these stresses, there's also the oscillations on the east coast tend to be a bit more intense, whereas on the west coast the Lewin current doesn't carry down as much intense heat. So even in Shark Bay, where it does get really, really hot, these corals are used to this because it's more of a constant. It's not a big flush in of heat like what they're used to, what happens on the east coast.
Sorry, Cecile here. While Shannon's answering, do you mind just muting at the nagal end? I'm hearing a bit of feedback. I'm not sure if Shannon can.
Yep, I will. Do we have any other questions?
Love to hear more questions. It's just, yeah, the answers.
Which WA reef is your favourite?
Well, that's a hard question because I love these really bizarre muddy turbid reefs up in the Pilbara, but I'm also a sucker for like a beautiful temperate reef with amazing kelp and really cool corals. But then again, Ningaloo is amazing. I'm just a all-round Western Australian reef lover. And then there's also this super amazing resilient corals up off of the Kimberley that are exposed for large periods of the day and they're really turbid. Yeah, it's hard to say. Our reefs are so diverse and incredible. It's hard to find a bad one. I'm a massive advocate that WA reefs are better than East Coast reefs, so we've got the best ones.
Does anyone have any good reef stories? As I mentioned earlier, these guys were off to Abrolhos next week, next Friday, for a day trip. So enjoying the reef there. Oh, I'll mute that.
Yeah, I heard you guys are also some of you are getting your coxswains as well, which is really awesome and really useful. So I was lucky enough to do my coxswains during my PhD, and so that's a potential other, instead of research, could have gone and done skippering, which is really tempting.
Yeah,
Fun job.
these guys will also do, or many of them have opted into an open water dive next term. So they're beginning the journey.
Awesome. Good to hear. There's also other avenues besides research with diving as well. With commercial diving is really awesome and fun as well. So, yeah.
Okay, I'll just ask a question about commercial diving. What sort of depths is that in that you?
So I'm just a level 1 commercial diver, so that's more like scientific diving. That's only down to 30 meters where most of our work is. But then there's level 2, 3 and 4. So I'm not totally off the top of my head across the depths of each of those, but like level 3 is when you get into your bell diving, where it gets like a lot deeper, and where you spend more time in chambers and stuff. So you got to learn to love your work crew when you get to that level.